Hi, I'm David Marks, and welcome to Woodworks. On today's show, we're going to make an MDF box. But before we make that box, we need to make an MDF jig. And before we make that jig, we need to make
Wait a minute! Haven't you learned anything, Grasshopper? Before we make the jig to make the jig, we need some MDF to make another jig.
I should have known.
Yep, it's all about the jig making. And I don't own stock in MDF, I swear. Well, hello, Mark and Nicole. Welcome back. You guys haven't been here in a while, so I'll take you on a tour of the shop. I'm sure you recognize the Workbench. Good old Workbench. I get a lot of people asking me questions as to how I put this together, and I guess we can come back to this later and do some details on it. But essentially, what this is an old record vise that I got probably back in the '80s, and it's encased in wood. The bottom line is that the metal jaws, this side has some Burmese padauk that I've laminated and bolted onto the end of the tail vise. And then the other side is bolted up underneath, but it's inlaid inside this block of wingy. So if you can see up underneath here, it's all bolted underneath. And it's a pretty straightforward setup, but I find that it works real well for me. And that way it essentially transforms the vise and elongates it into the width of the bench, which I think is about 20 inches wide. The top is all laminated out of walnut, and then for these sides here, I've got the traditional dog holes. So essentially when I glued this up, I was able to set up my dado blade on the table saw and then cut out these dado holes at an angle and then laminate all this back together. So these blocks are pretty close to 4 inches thick. They're about 3 7/8 or 3 3/4. And the dovetails, all these dovetails I cut on the bandsaw. And I've had enough interest in that at some point I will probably be coming out with a DVD on how to cut these types of large dovetails on the bandsaw. The nice thing about that is that it's really pretty straightforward. I call them hand cut because I'm still laying those out by hand. I am essentially setting the bandsaw for the drift angle of the blade, and then what I'll do is I'll move the fence over to the appropriate spacings and tilt the table at an angle, make my cuts, and then when it comes time to chop it, I still chop them all by hand with a sharp chisel. And as you can see, it works pretty well. I think it's a lot easier to do it on the bandsaw than to take a great big old bow saw and to try to cut all those by hand. So that's kind of the quick rundown on the Workbench. The bottom is all laminated out of walnut. I did study with a little bit with Makoto Amai, a Japanese timber framer back in the 80s. And so this was something that impressed me from Makoto's benches, this sort of carved Asian style foot. And this is all laminated out of walnut. And then there's a mortise and tenon joint that goes down into this. And it's locked and pegged over there. And then the stretcher or the trestle member is also piercing through this column with an integral tenon that comes through there. So it's been a good rock solid Workbench for me.
Now,
held up well over the years.
Does it walk on you at all? Because I've got one that's also a single sort of pedestal base like that, but it's not heavy enough, and it moves.
Oh, okay.
So I'm thinking the next one is going to be a four-legged,
right.
More heft. Do you have that problem?
This one is pretty solid. I can probably do a full body lift off of this.
Oh my God.
So I'd say it's pretty solid. It's about 4 inches thick. I think about 6 feet long. I have a shim underneath here, so I put a little wedge underneath here. So yeah, you want those benches to have a lot of heft to it. You don't want it to, rock back and forth as you're working on it.
Sure.
So another question that's come up has been my router table. So this is my router table here. We're coming up on almost 5 years post Woodworks. So after doing the television show, I came back and got one of these Jessam router lifts. And these things will lift out of the router table. And this just allows you easier access to the router. So I've got a Porter cable, 3 1/4 horsepower Speedmatic. And the construction of the table itself is essentially a torsion box. So I have a half-inch thick plywood on the top, half-inch thick plywood on the bottom, and I've got these ribs that are about 2 inches tall and centered approximately on 4-inch centers. I think it might have worked out to 3 7/8. But torsion boxes, as you know, are just a rock-solid method of construction. I use these quite a bit in my work, and it's just a good way to make a good, stable, strong surface. Now, another thing that I use with a router table, because a lot of people have emailed me and asked how I change my router bits all the time. And one thing that I did was I made up some wrenches that are bent. So this one is bent at an angle. So that way I could change these above the table surface here. And inside here, this is all lined with this cardboard-like material. This just sort of dampens out the sound. So the router lifts are quite cool. There's a number of brands on the market, but that way you can put the key in here and raise or lower the router bit. And then there's another mechanism that lifts out this insert here. And then I could get it down inside with this and then use that to change the bits. So just another way to do it. There's a lot of different ways to do this stuff. Bottom line is whatever works. You recall the old jointer? Still running nice, the 16-inch jointer. The aircraft carrier. As you know, I travel a lot. I teach a lot of classes. And people are always saying, how big is that giant jointer? Believe it or not, one of the guys that I studied with, Gary Bennett, has one that's 3 feet wide. So this one's small compared to his.
That's crazy.
So it's all relative. But I got it used for $1,700. In fact, this is what it looked like way back in the 80s, around 1984. Got this from John DeMarchi down in Petaluma. He's a fabulous craftsman, artist, sculptor, woodworker, metalworker, machinist. So basically what I did was I had to clean it up. I sandblasted all the surface. I wet sanded the table. Rented a truck with a hydraulic lift gate so I could get it up onto the back of the truck. And here you can see where I've put some newspaper around it as I've put a steel plate and carborundum powder on there to lap the surface, which actually cleaned up quite nicely. I find that everything works better with a new coat of paint on it. So everything's going well there. This is my bandsaw. People ask me about buying used tools. This was my old Delta Milwaukee Crescent. So when I got it, it was painted Battleship Gray, and it had all kinds of gunk on the inside. So I went through and I sandblasted it and replaced the bearings over here. And now this thing just resaws beautifully. I had to go through and balance some of the tires here. So I had to replace the rubber on the tires and then ground these so that they're concentric to the shaft. Found that talcum powder works well to sand the rubber. But you do want to make some sort of a jig that's hinged. So as you thread that thing upwards, it's going to hold it in registration up against the tire. And then basically just sand this down so that the tire is concentric to the shaft. That reduces any of the vibration that's going from left to right. Got one of my favorite expressions over here. I think a lot of woodworking is positive thinking. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. That has held true many, many times over the years. Yeah, it's funny. You get somebody in a class and they say, I can't do it. And pretty soon they find out they're right. So let's take a look in the classroom here. This is our new wing that we added on probably right around the time when we were just starting to do the television show. We needed some place for storage. And at that time, we were just stacking up the furniture in here. And at one point, the furniture was stacked all the way up to the ceiling as we were going through our various, just various stages. Now we've changed this into a classroom. I'm teaching classes here. Typically, we'll have maybe about 10 students at a time. We have benches. All these benches are all torsion boxes, so they're all 4 inches thick. very solid, flat and stable. And various tool cabinets. We've got all the various tools on display. We've got the important things over here, which is, well, we have music, which is very important. We have the microwave, the snacks, the coffee machine, refrigerator, you know, all the necessities. Want everybody to feel comfortable while they're out here. And books, we got tons of books. So if a student comes out and if they're working on a project, they can go through the library and just look at all these various books. These are some fantastic books on marquetry from France. And these were masterpieces of marquetry by Pierre Ramon. So some of the stuff is just, you know, phenomenal. We think the stuff that we're doing is complicated. Well, I guess these guys didn't have TV back then, so they had lots of time to do all kinds of insane marquetry projects.
Is that you?
That one. Oh yeah, that is me. Well, okay, now the truth comes out. Back in the 80s, I got as far as building the workbench, but I had to put it on sawhorses till I had time to make the base for it. So that was the bearded David. I kind of look young for my age, so I always had a beard because it was like that story with Aesop's fables. They never thought that you were old enough to be good at something. So for about 20 years I had a beard. Our kids never really knew me without a beard.
That's great.
And now that I'm older, I've shaved the beard off. So we got more storage cases up there.
What's that?
This is a sculpture. It's a work in progress, although it's been on the back burner for a while. This is, I'm going to be teaching a new class at the Marc Adams School. Oh, I'm not sure if it's next May or I forget the date, but it'll be in the catalog. And this is a system that I employ for sculptures. It's what I call a curved torsion box. And Mark, you helped me with some of those several years ago. Yeah. So essentially it's a method of constructing stuff out of plywood and then making the ribs out of plywood, but covering it over with a thin plywood skin. And then I'll do 2 layers to make it, you know, really lightweight and strong. Once I've got that done, then I can veneer it or I can gild it, do patinas on it, just a whole variety of surface treatments. This one is, well, it's got this extra detail in here, which is a tapered bentwood lamination. It's got layers of, it's wangi, purple heart, Burmese padauk, another layer of wangi, and then yellow heart, and then it just repeats on and on and on. Now these are probably about a 1/16 of an inch thick here, and then they do this S-curve bend and taper it down to pretty much a feather edge in the very center. And I have had this mounted on the lathe. I'll remount it and I'll come back with a boring bar and hollow out the center. And then I probably will leave those negative spaces here. And then I still have to decide what surface treatment I'm going to put on the outside of it. Thank you. Fun stuff. Lots of cool stuff. So, what's that?
The clamp wall.
Oh yeah. Those are my inexpensive clamps. I've got the better clamps in the other room, and you can see some just other, I don't know if you call it works in progress or projects that might just be destined to collect dust. Sometimes you go down a path and decide to change your route there. You can see one of the old duck heads off of my duck head table. It's my famous Egyptian inspired table here. So this, when I was doing them, I had access to a duplicarver. So rather than just making one, I made 8 heads at a time. So this one's all carved, but you know the carving hasn't been done here. And the eyes I did out of ebony and ivory. I really struggled for about a year as to what to do with the eyes. The eyes are really a focal point of the piece. And this is probably, you know, this shape here is after probably doing maybe 4 or 5 that ended up in the scrapwood pile because some of them look too much like cartoon characters. And I wanted this to have, you know, somewhat of a serious look to it. It sold for a lot of money, so it has to have some sort of a classical look to it. But I found that, you know, black and white was kind of the perfect answer, and used some ebony for the eyes and a little bit of fossilized walrus tusk ivory for the white part. And then I started to prepare the surface for gilding around the eyes because I did a faux lapis finish. But that's as, well, that's as far as I got on this one. I've got a whole set of these, so maybe at some point I'll get back to it and make another table. Many projects in the works.
It's this one right here.
Yeah, the one that's on my our T-shirts there. Yeah, so that's something that we sell from our website.
Perfect.
All right, so this I think is a new addition since you were here. The big bandsaw.
Actually, I think this just came in.
Is that right?
And I think Jerome and I were the first ones to break the first blade, if I remember correctly. Or put a nice bend in the first blade.
Oh, okay, cutting up the walnut burl. Okay, that sounds about right. Yeah. So this thing's been a great workhorse. I've got just a single what do you call these things? A runner. Thank you for the crosscut sled, and then that way I can take the burl and put it on this, put it up against a backstop, and slide this thing back and forth. The fence with this one, I went a little bit of the extra distance and built a torsion box fence. So this fence is also a torsion box. Again, it's going to retain its stiffness, flatness, resistance to bending and warping and twisting. It's just going to be very, very stable. So if I want to resaw some wide pieces, I can crank this thing way up here.
That's a 36-inch unit?
This is a 36-inch bandsaw that opens up to 22 inches of resaw capacity. That's a lot of resaw capacity. And I like my funny little tag on there, dream big. You got to. Speaking of dreaming big, over here, I've been doing a lot of wall sculptures in recent years. And these are a couple of current ones that I'm working on here. These are some of the bigger ones. These are just shy of 4 feet in diameter. So I have 2 of these in the works. And essentially, these are all glued up out of kiln-dried poplar. And I like to use the urea resin glue. I'm specifically using the Urac 185 brand. I also work with the Unibond 800. And these get mounted onto the lathe. I basically screw on a faceplate here. And that way I can turn this whole thing very slowly. Because the bigger the diameter, the faster the speed races on the outside circumference. Always turning very, very slow in the center, but it can go a lot faster on the outside. So this one will get shaped into a large disc shape, and then at that point I'll probably gild it with some different types of metals, and I'll also incorporate some wood into it. I'm selling more and more in Hawaii these days. I've got a gallery on the Big Island, and they sold 3 pieces for me in the past year. So that's where I'm gearing my work towards these days.
Do you find the show has influenced your sales, or is this just purely on liking the product?
You know what? I think the people that watch Woodworks are do-it-yourselfers. The people that go to the gallery and buy my work are collectors, and they don't even know I have a show. So I don't think it's really made much difference. I don't know. This is my one-way lathe. That's the main one that I turn on. But for the school, I've invested in 10 of these Vicmark lathes. So this is a Vicmark lathe. This one comes from, they come from Australia, and this is one that they've got made. That one's not plugged in. But the nice thing about these guys is they all have the electronic variable speed control. So what I can do is I can use this as the same way as I use the big lathes. In other words, you can just turn the dial and you can make the thing go really, really slow or really, really fast. So that electronic variable speed control is a really nice feature. And when we're doing classes, essentially what I'll do is I'll clear out the whole room in here and set this up with the lathes. So like I said, we'll have 10 lathes in here, and then I'll be up here in the front and instructing on that one. And then we can have students come in, and everybody does projects. We do a box, and then we do a vessel, and we do bowls. And we have a lot of fun. People really enjoy themselves. We've also had guest instructors out here.
Nice.
Yeah, we've had Michael Hosluck from Canada, and Mike Chakowski, a friend of mine from San Diego, and Malcolm Tibbetts from up around the Tahoe area. And in the spring, we're hoping to bring out Stuart Batty. I've already talked to Stuart Batty, and Stuart's agreed to come out and teach a class. And we're also hoping to have Eli Avicera from Israel, somebody I spoke to, and he's also another amazing turner. These are my tool racks over there. A lot of people have been enjoying those things. You got to have some cool tool racks. You know, a little bit of spalted maple with some natural edges on there. Got a Mini-Max 20-inch bandsaw here. So when we're doing classes on resawing, we've got the Mini-Max over here with one of those carbide blades on it. We also have a Delta 18-inch over there, which also has a carbide blade on it. So just trying to mix it up a little bit and show people different machines to work on and different ways to resaw. I like to put these auxiliary fences on there because that allows them some stability for cutting stuff at an extra height. Then over here we got the multi-router, which a lot of people have seen me use on the show. And what I tell people about the show is that we basically had 20 minutes to do something that might take 80 hours to build. And the producers were always looking for some way to speed up time. So when it came to the joinery, there's nothing like having something like this to speed up the joinery process. So, what's cool about this thing is that it slides back and forth. It moves on Thompson linear motion bearings. And yes, it is an expensive machine. We do sell it from our website. It's $2,700. But if somebody wanted to make one, I've heard of guys getting plans where they've made them using ball bearing drawer slides and stuff, and they work well enough. But it's the old expression: if you have the money, you're always better off to spend the money to get the best quality tool that you can afford at the time. This is my vacuum press table over here. Although right now it's covered up because I'm using it as a packing table. But you can see I've got one of my bags and the platen over there, or platen. And when I'm not doing some vacuum pressing, what I'll do is I'll put a blanket on top, then I'll put a piece of MDF on top of that, and then that way I can use it for other operations without being in risk of damaging the vacuum bag. So I try to keep a lot of new tools and equipment on hand for students to work with, although we're also trying to keep it sort of low tech because we realize that a lot of people are working in small shops. They don't have CNC machines, and I'm a hands-on kind of guy, so I like to do stuff as efficiently as possible, so I'm using as many power tools as I can, but I also like to do the hand tools. You really can't finesse stuff without having the hand tools. It comes down to sharp chisels and scrapers and sharp hand planes and sharp turning tools.